Psalm 75, to the chief musician, set to Do Not Destroy, a psalm of Asaph, a song. To you, O God, do we give thanks. Yes, to you we give thanks. For that your name is near to us, your wondrous works declare. When my appointed time has come, I will judge uprightly. Though earth and all its dwellers sway, I make its pillars firm. Selah. To fools I said, don't be foolish. To vile men, lift no horn. Do not lift up your horn on high, nor speak with a stiff neck. For exaltation comes not from the east or west or south, but God is judge. He puts down one and lifts up another. The Lord's hand holds a cup of wine, deep red and strongly mixed. He pours it out. The wicked of the earth will drink it down. To Jacob's God I will sing praise. Forever I'll declare, all horns of sinners I'll cut off. Raise those of the righteous. You may be seated. There should be a handout in your seats for Psalm 75. So to begin with, we want to look at who's the author of this psalm. Asaph is credited as Psalm of Asaph, though many believe it was written or dictated by David and then put into song form by Asaph. It's directed to the chief musician, which indicates that this was delivered with the intent of being sung in the corporate temple worship. The tune is interesting. It's set to Do Not Destroy. So most believe that this is a well-known tune or melody used in temple worship. However, some also believe that this is a plea for God's mercy upon his people. Only 4 psalms are set to Do Not Destroy, and those are Psalm 57, 58, 59, and this one, 75. And they do share a common theme. Psalm 57 is when David's in a cave regarding his personal deliverance. Psalm 58 is regarding unjust rulers, speaking to justice in society. Psalm 59 is speaking of Saul's men and speaking about the protection from persecutors. And this psalm is speaking of a global judgment and a preservation to God's people. So across these 4 Do Not Destroy tunes, psalms that contain these tunes, we see it moves from an individual cry, such as, Lord, don't let me die, to a communal cry, to don't let the wicked destroy justice and God's people, to a universal cry, that do not destroy the righteous in your worldwide judgment. So Spurgeon says that, is quoted as saying, here are the prayers of saints in danger, whether hunted by Saul, hemmed in by persecutors, oppressed by unjust judges, or in fear lest wrath should consume them, and all cry out, destroy not. Next, we see that this is a psalm of Asaph, a song. When you see that listed side by side like that, this indicates that it was intended for reading or singing. As we dig into the psalm, we notice it is written in a noted symmetry and balance, and many scholars often see it as a chiasm or in a chiasm style. Both Matthew Henry and Calvin describe this psalm in a way that matches a chiastic pattern. And so if you were to summarize their positions in a chiastic form, this is what it would look like. A would be thanksgiving for God's wondrous works in verse 1. Verses 2 through 3 is God speaking, judgment at the appointed time. C would be warning to the proud in verses 4 and 5. C prime would be God humbles the proud and speaks of the cup of judgment in verses 6 through 8. B prime would be God exalts the righteous, casts down the wicked in verse 9. And finally, an A prime ends with thanksgiving, praise to the God of Jacob in verse 10. So as we move into verse 1, we see that the psalmist begins immediately with the language of joy and thanksgiving. The repetition of giving thanks serves to show us the zeal in singing praises to God. Your name is near to us reminds us that God's presence is near and that his name is well known and his power has been granted to his people in his time of need in the past. When we move into verses 2 and 3, it says, when my appointed time has come, I will judge uprightly. Though earth and all its dwellers sway, I make its pillars firm. Selah. What's interesting here is that you see the commentators are divided on this verse. Some, such as Henry and Poole, conclude that these verses should be attributed to David, referring to the time before he ruled Israel. So, if so, this view would be viewed as David's acknowledgement that despite the congregation being slow to gather to him, he knows that what God has spoken will come to pass, and that when it does, David is committing to judging uprightly and make the pillars that God has established firm. Other commentators, such as Calvin and Spurgeon, believe that these verses to be the voice of God, saying that he will take his seat of judgment in his timing, and that he makes the earth's pillars firm or upholds them. This reminds us that we have no real cause for fear if we trust in God's sovereignty. So why, when we see a difference like this between commentators, it's an opportunity to be able to dive a little bit deeper to see why would they come to different conclusions. I believe part of the reason could be due to some differences in the translations. So what I've listed out for you in the handout there is the difference when you put the King James Version next to the New King James Version. Notice the King James Version says, "When I shall receive the congregation, I will judge uprightly. The earth and all its inhabitants thereof are dissolved. I bear up the pillars of it." The New King James says, "When I choose the proper time, I will judge uprightly. The earth and all its inhabitants are dissolved. I set pillars up firmly." First thing to note here is that there's a lack of quotations in the King James Version. And that's because there are no quotation marks in King James Version at all. That was not part of the English style when it was written. So you can see an example here of like John 7:37 when Jesus is saying something. And you notice in the King James Version it says, "Jesus stood and cried, saying, If any man thirst, let him come unto me and drink." No quotation marks. The New King James says, "Jesus stood and cried out, saying, quote, If anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink." So this is something to notice whenever you're looking at the King James. There are no quotation marks at all. It's all handled with punctuations and interpretation. So in translating this verse, the New King James translators desire to make it clear that they believed who was speaking here. Other modern translations, such as the ESV or the NASB, also have quotation marks added. Second, when we look at this, we see the wording's quite different as well. The King James says, "When I shall receive the congregation," and the New King James says, "When I choose the proper time." It seems like quite a difference. But when we dig into the original Hebrew, we could determine that these translations come to be. We find the root differences in verse 2 revolve around the Hebrew word moed. So moed can be translated in many different ways. In the basic root sense, it means an appointment or a fixed time. From that primary meaning, moed develops into other uses. In the KJV, moed is translated as congregation 150 times. Feast is 23 times, season 13 times, appointed 12 times, and assembly 4 times. So we see examples of this like in Genesis 18:14. It says, "At the appointed time, I will return unto thee." That's moed. But then in Leviticus 23:2, it says, "Concerning the feast of the Lord." Feast is also moed. Exodus 27 says, "In the tabernacle of the congregation." Congregation, again, is the Hebrew word moed. And Psalm 74, verse 8 says, "They burned up all the synagogues of God in the land." That is also the same Hebrew word moed. And then finally we get to this Psalm 72, verse 5, or 75, verse 2, and that's when you see the difference. King James using the congregation, and the New King James using the appointed time. So both are legitimate translations of moed. KJV leans on the assembly or congregation sense, and the New King James returns to the appointed time sense, which is closer to the proper root meaning. So neither translation is wrong. However, you can see that if you have the typical reading of the King James, it would lend itself to make you interpret this as being words of David. And Matthew Henry, who was using the KJV primarily in his commentary because he was writing all this in the early 1700s, he favored the use of viewing this as coming from David, being David's words. John Calvin, however, was using the original Hebrew and Greek and sometimes Latin Vulgate. He was a skilled linguist. He would preach directly from the Hebrew. And he came before that translation, and he favors crediting these verses to God. So that's not to say that just modern theologians who use KJV credit this to David, because Spurgeon also used KJV. So it just proves that it's important to dive in and to use proper hermeneutics when we see differences like this. So given all that, I would side with the opinion that verses 2 and 3 should be attributed to God and not to David directly. And when you notice the wording in our Psalter, it says, "When my appointed time has come," and "my" is capitalized, inferring that it's God speaking. And so, however, if you say these verses are the words of David, then your applications are still good. David is a type of Christ, and thus the words in Scripture are the words of Christ. So in either case, these are the words of God being communicated through typology of David or directly quoted by God. In essence, these are God's words, right? So we don't need to be fearful that there's any problems with the translations. So going into verse 3, we see that though earth and all its dwellers sway, I make its pillars firm. So these verses are also applicable to Christ, whose coming makes the earth to sway and to be shaken. But as soon as he comes, he will establish firm and solid foundations for his elect, who are renewed by the Spirit. We shall find new stability and assurance in Christ. Matthew 7:24-25 says, therefore, whoever hears these sayings of mine and does them, I will liken him to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain descended, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, and it did not fall, for it was founded on the rock. When we move into verses 4 and 5, here we see God's quote continuing. He has already established that his office as a judge. Now he moves on to what he says to be an unfaithful or a foolish person. It should be noticed as a psalmist here showing that the reason men do the evil they do is that they are blinded by pride. They form an exaggerated estimate of their own power. Do not lift your horn on high is repeated twice, and then followed with, nor speak with a stiff neck. This means that they are called to not be proud or raise their horn on high, but to be humble. This applies to direction not to speak harshly or injuriously, because a proud person often stiffens their necks and raises their hand when they pour out their condemnations. So you think of stiff-neckedness, that's a prideful person pouring out their condemnations. Moving into verses 6 and 7, here we're given the remedy for correcting pride. The reminder that advancement comes not from anyone on earth, but from God alone. God's providence is real, and nothing happens by chance. God is the judge, and he is the one who raises up and puts down. So even when things seem hopeless and we see no way out, we can find peace, reminding ourselves that God is the one who is in control. He is judging now. His seat is not vacant. There's not an empty judgment seat. God is judging now. Empires rise and fall at his bidding. He is the King of kings and Lord of lords. Kings are but puppets in his hands, and they serve his purpose. Going into verse 8, for the Jews, red wine was the strongest and sharpest. The cup is often used to refer to God's wrath. The picture we see here is that there will be no escape for the wicked. God will drag them out to their deserved punishment. God has a cup to make the wicked and ungodly drunk, even to the point of death. The wine is red. Its taste is full and strongly mixed. It's filled to the brim with indignation. This is God's judgment, and it is poured out on them. All of it, down to the dregs, which is the sediment at the bottom of the cup. Isaiah 51:17 says, awake, awake, stand up, O Jerusalem, you have drunk at the hand of the Lord, the cup of his fury. You have drunk the dregs of the cup of trembling and drained it out. God's divine vengeance is incredible, and it will be impossible for the ungodly to escape drinking from the cup. They will be compelled to drain it to the last drop. They will drink it and lose all ability to control themselves, leaving them defenseless. This is the destiny of those who work against God. Verse 9, we now move on to seeing that while God's foes are drunk on the wine of wrath, the saints offer praises to God. While others are roaring in anguish, the elect can sing praises. The covenant God who delivered Jacob from so many afflictions, we should magnify. He has kept his covenant which he has made, and has redeemed his seed. And we end in verse 10, as power and liberty are being restored, justice will be executed, and the reign of the godless will be cut off. It was common in times for kings in this time period to put horns on their crowns. Spurgeon says that these men wore horns in those days as part of their state, and these both literally and figuratively were to be lopped off. For since God abhors the proud, his church will not tolerate them any longer. But the horns of the righteous shall be raised. And in a rightly ordered society, good men are counted as great. Virtue is admired, and grace is more esteemed than gold. We have a promise here that will come to pass. Christ is making all things new and putting every enemy under his foot. This is the hope we can rest in. So in conclusion, Psalm 75 is a psalm of judgment and praise with God's voice at the center. It teaches us that God alone determines the timing and execution of judgment. Pride is futile, for God humbles the arrogant and exalts the lowly. God's wrath is certain for the wicked, but his preservation is sure for the righteous. So how do we apply this to us? As believers, we can find comfort and peace that passes all understanding. No matter the wickedness that we witness going on in the world, we know that it's all being done within the providence of God and for his holy purposes. Even when nations shake, we can rest in his providence, knowing that he upholds the pillars of the earth. So this is our postmillennial hope. God wins. The final word is not destruction, but praise to the God of Jacob. We should focus on working towards his purposes, fully trusting in him and knowing that we are guaranteed success because it is God's success, not ours. This psalm of hope was written in a time when God's chosen people were limited to a single nation, looking forward to the reign of Christ. How much more should we have now? How much more hope should we have now, seeing all that he has done since this psalm was written? The gospel of Christ is spread throughout the world and is still penetrating hearts to this day. So we should keep fighting the good fight and working toward the day when every knee shall bow and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Any questions or comments from those with speaking rights?